Good morning, everybody. My name is Lorraine Sanda, and thank you to Bream and to Anya for inviting me here to Dublin. It's a real privilege to be here in your beautiful city. I had a chance to walk around a bit yesterday afternoon and hopefully get a chance to see a bit more of it today. So it's a real pleasure for me to be here with you as you have your annual national conference. I want to tell you a little bit about what we've been doing in Scotland. Some of it will sound very familiar to your own journey here in Ireland. Some of it will sound a bit different. And I hope that you will get a little bit of inspiration, and you'll also get a chance to reflect on some of the things and think, what does that mean for us here in our schools across Ireland? A little bit about me. I'm used to speaking to audiences who know a little bit about me. I used to work for the UK government a long time ago in my first career, and then my first daughter was born with quite severe disabilities, so I had to leave that post that I was in London at the time. And I suppose that's when I fell into parental involvement, because if any of you in the audience here have a child with disabilities or additional support needs, you know that they need you more. They know that they need you in their life, and schools need you in their life too. And so that's how I fell into parental involvement. I suppose as a parent campaigner, actually, to try and make sure that the schools listened to me as a parent, but then I realised how important it was for other parents to have somebody to help them speak up too. So I was involved at a local level in my own area in Scotland, and then became involved in almost in a training and development role in our agency that supports schools, and then ended up moving over to Scottish Government because the time was right for us to take a much more strategic focus on parental involvement in Scotland. So that's a little bit about me. A little bit about Scotland. I'm sure many of you have been to Scotland or know a little bit about Scotland, but that's our local authority areas in Scotland. We've got Shetland and Orkney, way up in the north, with some very diverse areas, rural schools, island schools, places where children have to go to school by ferry in the morning, and places where children have to stay overnight on the mainland and then go home at the weekend. We've got the Western Isles, which are very similar. We've got some very small schools with school rolls down to below 10, and others much bigger, and very diverse areas in Highland, Aberdeenshire, and then we've got a big area in the Central Belt. A little bit different from here in Ireland in as much that our local authorities in all of those areas run our schools. They manage our schools and they employ our teachers. So we have an arm's length approach in Scotland. So we don't directly manage, we fund our local authorities to manage the schools in Scotland. I suppose what we do have is many of the similarities in terms of social and cultural approaches to the way that our people live and have their education in Scotland. We've got a lot of the social problems that I'm sure you've got here in Ireland in terms of unemployment, particularly at this point in time. We've got migrant workers, we've got a very diverse population. We've got schools where some of the children come from very different backgrounds. I was in a school the other day and the teacher was saying we've got 32 different languages in this school. So we've got, I'm not sure you've got that range, but you'll have something fairly similar, I would think. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about our parental involvement journey in Scotland, which is ongoing. And it's one of those things that will never be over, and I think we just continually need to refresh and think, where are we going with this? And we have new challenges thrown at us all the time. So our journey is certainly not over. Some of it will be at similar stages of yours here in Ireland, and other bits you'll have surpassed and you will think that you're on to another stage. We did have new legislation in 2006. Parental involvement legislation, which allowed us to renew our focus on parental involvement, and I think renewing that focus is certainly the way that we approached it. We've had parents involved in Scottish education and the rights to be involved in schools for a very long time, just the same way as you have in Ireland, you know, back 50 years. But it was very much felt that we had to bring it up to date, that we needed legislation that was much more reflective of where parents were and what they wanted from their schools and what they wanted that involvement to look like. So we had new legislation. We definitely had to challenge some of the attitudes that existed around Scottish education in terms of stereotypical parents being a problem for Scottish education. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, but I think there's definitely attitudes that we had to keep parents at arm's length, and that teachers were in schools to teach and they weren't in schools to deal with parents. And I think we've challenged some of those, but you know, I would be wrong to say that they had completely gone altogether. Definitely much a change in culture about what is education for, and what is it that the role of parents must do to help schools. And I think so we've had to change that culture, and again that's one of those processes that is ongoing. We've been going through a huge amount of educational change, a massive change in Scottish education. Probably the biggest change we've ever had in Scottish education is underway at this point in time. It started in 2003, and we're nearly through the process of implementing all the changes that has been required by that change. And we've really changed the way that we think about education in Scotland, and I'll come back a little bit about that later on. The same as you have heard at the beginning today, there has been a stronger and stronger amount of research that proves that when parents are involved in their children's education, children do better. And I think we've got a huge bank of research now that tells us that that is just far too important to ignore, and we must think about what do we do with that research. And I think that research has got more and more advanced and more clever at telling us the things that actually do work in terms of involving parents in education. And I'll talk a little bit about that. But probably one of the most important things is the challenges that we face in Scotland, that you face in Ireland, and that are faced across the world, mean that we have to change the way that we educate our young people. And we have to do that alongside parents and alongside society. And I think if we don't do that, we won't be able to equip our young people for the challenges that lie ahead for them. So I think, for me, the overriding driver about meeting those challenges of the 21st century is the most powerful one in terms of how we take forward parental involvement in education. Quite simply, schools can't do this on their own. They need you as parents to be supporting them, and we in government can't do this without parents actually working alongside us. So I think the challenges are definitely there for all to see. We just have to be clever and better at how we do that. You've seen that, you've heard that already. There is no doubt in anybody's mind now that we know that when parents are involved. But I think that the bit at the bottom in the smaller writing is really, really important. It's about what parents actually do, rather than where the child is born, whether they come from a socially deprived background. It's actually what parents do that matters. And there's a lot of research in the States around black and ethnic minority communities of where education is valued and where parents are actually part of the school and are helped to support their children's learning, that proves that the background of families is not a deterrent completely from actually children doing better. And I think that's very important, because quite often, you know, we dismiss the idea that all parents can be involved, and I think it's really, really important not, you know, to remove that from our head. All parents can be involved. They might need different levels of support to be involved. I don't know if you've ever had Professor Charles Deforge speaking here in Dublin. He came to Scotland about 18 months ago to speak at a similar event to today's. He's a fantastic speaker. He's done research all around the world. He works out at the University of Exeter, the London School of Economics. He's advised the UK government. But very powerful research that he's gathered to prove the effect of parents. and balance that against the effect of schools, which I think is quite stark there on that slide. And that's one of, I mean, obviously, as children get older and the type of learning that they're doing in secondary, you would expect that the balance to change slightly. But even still at the age of 16, the effect on children's attainment and achievement is still there when parents are involved. But what a huge difference that is at age 7 in terms of the balance of what the difference that parents can make. And I think that's, to me, that was very, very powerful. I would strongly recommend anybody who's interested in following things up to look up Charles Deforge and some of his work. It's it's really interesting. And why is that? Well, you know, if you think about the amount of time that children spend in school, 15% of their time, where do they spend the rest of their time? They spend it with us as parents, they spend it in their community, they spend it in their clubs, they spend it with their friends. And I think the activities that they do out with school has to have a huge impact on their learning. And we have to start to look at that differently, I think, if we're going to maximise parental involvement in children's learning. The language that children develop from an early age comes from the home. A few years ago I was in schools and in quite a deprived area in one of our local authorities, and you know, there was a real emphasis on breakfast clubs and nurture groups for some of the children who just didn't have that opportunity to develop some of that language at home, and how they had to try and make up for that deficit that these children arrived with. But generally speaking, that's where children get the language, the reading, people talking to them. But don't forget secondary. And I think quite often I hear people saying, yeah, but parents don't need to be involved in secondary school. They don't have the opportunities. It's different in secondary school. Don't forget, children in secondary school do actually need their parents to be involved. It will look different. It needs to look different to reflect the changes as children move into secondary, but I think it's wrong to dismiss parental involvement in secondary. I know that's not what we're here to talk about today, but as your children move into secondary school, I think it's really, really important that parental involvement is strengthened in the secondary sector, and it's something that we've been really conscious to do in Scotland. Back to those challenging attitudes then, and I'm sure, I'm not going to go through all of these, but I'm sure some of those will sound familiar, but that was perhaps, you know, fairly prevalent in discussions that we would have had round tables in 2006 and 2007. I would like to think that we've moved quite away from there now. We have actually accepted that you can reach every parent. There's just, you know, for some parents you might have to have a really individual approach. In some schools you might have to have a much more wider whole school approach. But you can reach every parent. I also think that it's wrong to just assume, and I think our inspectorate in particular challenge schools that will come up with, well, parents are happy with what we do, so, you know, we're doing it all. We have to challenge that. What is it that you're actually doing to involve those parents? And if parents actually aren't aware that they should be involved, what are you doing to help them understand their role and what they can do to support it? So, the other thing I think that was quite prevalent in our discussions in those early days was this power balance of parents very much feeling that the power was on the balance was with the schools, in terms of the partnership was defined by schools. They defined how they would allow parents into school, how they would define the tasks that parents did, that they could become involved in. And that power balance, I think, has shifted quite considerably. And the partnership, for a variety of reasons, and one of them is how our parental representation has evolved, the partnership has shifted quite considerably. So it's about what parents and how parents want to be involved, rather than how teachers and schools will allow them to be involved. But very much that blame culture has had to stop, and I think it's not anybody's fault when parents aren't involved, but we have to find ways of overcoming that. So our legislation was concentrated on 3 specific areas: learning at home, homeschool partnership and parental representation, and we've been chipping away at those over the last 5-6 years. What we very much wanted was for all of those 3 areas to work together. So it wasn't just about the learning at home aspect. We wanted to work at all the three elements of our legislation together and build them all up to make sure that what was actually happening benefited children at the end of the day. And I've added in a more recent development, which is the National Parent Forum of Scotland. We have always had parent organisations in Scotland similar to here in Ireland, but we've got a new organisation which has particularly been set up to have a very strong parental voice at policy and decision making. I'm not going to go into that in any great detail, but I'll mention a little bit about it again later. Around that learning at home area, which is the theme of your conference today, we had to definitely convince people that the learning at home was crucial. The learning that goes on, just as you've seen on the previous slides, is absolutely vital to a child's achievement. And we were doing ourselves a real disservice by ignoring that. And I think we still are if we carry on with parental involvement without actually valuing that. But absolutely, we must provide support where it's needed, because not all parents, particularly those who have had bad experiences themselves, who come from a fairly low educational background themselves, who have got social problems, they don't know what to do at home with their child. They wouldn't automatically think, you know, like many of us in this room, that just by talking to your child, they were actually helping that child articulate and improve in their literacy skills, for example. So that support must be provided, and I think the gap, I'll talk a little bit more about one of our gaps in Scotland, which we really need to, you know, we're trying very hard to do something about, but the 20% of children in Scotland that don't do well by our education system, they need their parents involved more than any of us. And we have to find ways of involving those parents. And that has to be for some very intensive support. But there's other ways of doing that too. One of the things that we repeatedly get from our studies and our research in Scotland is that parents are generally satisfied with their school. It's back to that, you know, in our inspections they often say they're very satisfied with the learning and whatever. But they don't understand how the child's progress is described to them, and they don't know how to help. And I think that comes out repeatedly. Now, if that's what they're telling us over the years, we need to do something about that. So we need to give parents, and we need to teachers need to help parents know what it is that they can do to support learning. One of the ways that we have seen a big change is homework. Now, I don't know if any of you have read the book by Alfie Kohn, The Homework Myth. But it's quite an interesting book, and you know, you'll read it and you'll think, oh, get rid of homework, particularly in the primary sector. It doesn't do any good whatsoever. And other people will argue against that, and you know, I'm not going to come down on one side or the other today. But there is no doubt in the research that exists that homework in the primary sector needs to be interesting and relevant to children and their families for it to be of benefit. It's not about scrapping homework altogether, but what is the point in forcing a 7 or 8 year old to sit and do reading every night, cause a big fuss in the family, a big debate and lots of stress for everybody, for mums and kids and all the rest of it, and it's actually having no real impact. So, you know, in primary in particular, we've had a real change in the way that we look at homework. We still do a reading. We still, you know, encourage youngsters to read. That's very, very important. But we have actually started working on homework that is much more relevant to parents' lives, to families' lives, that is much more reflective of, can they do it all in one night? Can they have perhaps a week to consider whether, you know, what night in the week might be better for them? We've got dads who are working shifts who might want to be involved in homework, but you know, are not able to do it on a Tuesday night and a Wednesday night, but would love to be doing it on a Thursday or whatever. So a much more flexible approach to homework. So quite often our schools will now send home almost a menu of things that you can then pick out 5 tasks from a list of 20, and you pick out the tasks that are most relevant to your child and to your family circumstances, and you might do that over a period of 2 weeks. Now that learning is much more broad-based now, the learning that's going on at home. So it could be numeracy games, it could be playing cards, it could actually be sitting watching a TV programme and then talking about it afterwards. So that much more flexible approach to learning at home is something that has shifted quite considerably in our primary sector, I would say, over the last 2 or 3 years. There's another reason for that I'll come back to later on. We've just also completed, in fact just last week it completed its process through our parliamentary legislation system. We've changed the way that schools must provide information to parents. So we have a school handbook. We've had it, I'm sure you have a similar system here in Ireland. All schools, by law, must provide a school handbook for new parents coming into school. And we conducted a long consultation. I went around the country for lots and lots of visits and sessions with parents to say, what is it that you want from your school? And what came out overwhelmingly was what they wanted was information to support their child's learning. The handbook principally was a tool for parents to choose a school. So it had a lot of information in it about performance, which is controversial in itself because it didn't always reflect the ethos and the culture of the school. That's for another day. But what overwhelmingly came out from parents, and we did focus groups across a whole range of socio and economic backgrounds, was that what parents wanted was relevant information that helped them plan and accompany their child through their journey through school. They wanted to know where the key points were where they were being tested. They wanted to know where the key points were where they would make subject choices. They wanted to know if they were doing languages in primary school. They wanted to know, was the school really good at PE? And then they wanted to know what they could do to support that. So we're actually working on, that legislation will come into force at the end of this year, and we're working on the guidance at the moment. And the National Parent Forum of Scotland has helped us extensively with that to make sure that what parents are getting is a manual that helps them support their child's learning. It's not a manual that tells them how their school's doing in comparison to one in a completely different area of Scotland. So it's quite exciting actually, you know, that we're putting all these building blocks together and we're giving parents back some of the tools that they feel they want to support their child's learning. I think the other big focus has been around family learning, and we work very closely with the voluntary sector, with the community learning and development organisations that we have across, particularly to target family learning, so that we know that some parents need some learning support themselves, that they have poor literacy skills, they might have poor language skills, not just foreign language skills, but their own native language in Scotland as well. And so we've put a lot of support in around that family learning, so that parents and children are actually learning and doing together. At the same time, we had to strengthen that homeschool partnership. Now, when we talk about homeschool partnership, we're talking about how parents and schools interact. And I think we've changed the focus on that quite considerably, as opposed to we tell you as a parent what it is that this school's doing, to much more about you're a partner in our school and that we can do this together. So it's much more about what skills do parents have that can come into the school, and I'm sure you've got some of that in many of your schools that are represented here today. But I think we've had to break down the barriers that parents are welcome and are part of the school, not just for their own child, but as an asset and a resource for the school. And when parents and teachers are working together at home or within the school, we're doing so much more for children, and that's the driving factor behind this. We know that pupil behaviour improves, and we know that achievement improves when we can do that. It's so powerful when children see their parents working alongside teachers as opposed to a them and us culture. And I think that's really, really important to change that culture. That, you know, that we shouldn't be criticising teachers in front of pupils and vice versa. But the way to do that is to show that we can do this together. We're grown-ups in this. We should be demonstrating how it's actually done. And I think, back to that additional support needs bit, you know, we have so much expertise and information as parents that schools can benefit from. And I think sometimes that was not used or maximised. And I think we have actually began to recognise that that is very, very important, that we must use what parents are actually telling us. Parents have told us that they don't want this formal approach to being involved. It must be relaxed, it must be flexible, it must be inclusive, and it must be fun. And I think that's one of the driving factors behind. We don't want the fun police, saying that it has to be formal. It has to be fun when parents are involved, otherwise they're not going to come back. That flexibility is important. Not all parents can turn up at night time. Not all parents can turn up during the day. Not all parents are able to do volunteering because of their jobs. It just has to be flexible, and I think we have to have a system of parental involvement that is flexible. One of the other things I think is very significant is the role of our parent councils, and I think I mention this because it is important for you here today. Our parent councils told us that they didn't want to be involved in running our schools. They felt that that was the job of head teachers and managers. They wanted to support them in that, but they didn't want to be doing that particular job. But they do want to be involved in supporting the learning, and I think there's a slight subtle difference there that we've taken forward. So our parent councils, their focus now is much more around learning, and when our inspectors go into schools, they want to see that what parent councils are doing is supporting the learning. It's supporting the achievement of children, and that's the bar that they have raised. It's very much about not just providing newsletters anymore. It's about what are you doing as a parent council, and talking to the parent council to think about what type of support they're providing to the school on that. We've got a new education system in Scotland well underway at the moment. And again, it's just a really important message that, providing education at the time that we're providing it at this stage in the way things are globally, we have to provide an education that is much more encompassing, all-encompassing than an academic system that is focused on exams. And that's what we've tried to do in Scotland. It's much more about preparing our children for the world. And that world is getting more challenging and is changing all the time. It is impossible, in my view, to do that without involving parents. We need our parents as partners as we move forward with a change, but more importantly, we can't prepare children for the world without involving parents in that. It's just impossible. So I think these things have all just happened to be working together at the same time. So we're changing what's been taught, we're changing how children are being taught, different types of lessons and different types of exams, and it's much more, that academic and the knowledge is still very, very important, but we're preparing children for the world of work, we're preparing them to be lifelong learners, we're preparing them to be able to cope with a number of changes that they might have. How many jobs do people have today, changing back and forward? They don't have a job for life anymore. Many people have up to 30 jobs in their career now. So it's I think it's very powerful to think about what we're doing and what our children, what type of world they're having to grow up in, and then thinking, how do parents support that? Our education system in Scotland needs to do better. We want it to do better. We want all our children to do better. But the link with parents is crucial to that. And I think we're very, very clear on that. We can't do the best for all our children without working with parents. So what are we doing differently now? Parents are in schools. They're actually planning lessons. They're doing things alongside teachers. They're planning learning that is relevant to their particular village, their particular area. They're using parent skills. This is a science week in a school up in Aberdeen where the parents themselves run the science week. They're in the school. They're in doing experiments. They're in actually working with the children. They're there, not as teachers, as parents, but they're part of the school. Involving parents all the way through. Our parents are in our schools all the time now, and I think that's really, really important. They're in to see how learning looks different, so that they can then relate to that, to what they're doing at home. And very, very importantly, we need head teachers and teachers to be listening to parents. Without listening to parents, how can you possibly provide an education for the children in your school? And parents need to understand how that learning is changing and be in there doing it with them. So I'm not going to tell you very much more about my role, but very much our journey has been about that whole-scale cultural and structural change. School level, local level, national level. We've been chipping away at all of those levels for the last 5 or 6 years. And very much showing that families do matter. And I think providing that leadership at a government level has been very, very important. We've got ministers who, I'm sure like Rory here today, are very committed to showing that parents have to be part of our education system at all levels. And we have a minister who phones our parent organisations. We have to put together the plan for this, but on a weekly basis he phones, he visits schools. We've got parents talking to ministers and talking to us at all levels. Fundamental is a whole school approach, that our schools must consider how they are involving parents. They must set that out for parents. They're required to do so by our legislation and by our parental involvement strategy that authorities are required to do. And this handbook strengthens that even further, the requirement on it. But very much it has to be focused on attainment and achievement. Let's not forget why we're doing this. We're doing this because children matter and we want children to do better. The leadership within our schools, within our parent organisations is already there, I believe. I think we just have to draw that out. That's my vision, and I really hope that we've got to the top of that now. We're actually sharing and actually developing and co-creating with parents. We're not just telling them anymore how it should be done. It's been a long journey, but I think we're definitely at the stage where we're actually sharing and we're developing things together. I asked the National Parent Forum what they thought was unique about what we were doing in Scotland. And I think that focus on children, focus on partnership, focus on relationships, and actually being very clear about what it is that we wanted to achieve. You can achieve it. I'm sure you've achieved many of these things already. And we're still on that journey, and there's still more that I want to achieve in parental involvement in Scotland. And I wish you very well with your journey here in Ireland as well. Thank you very much for listening.